If you had one shot, one opportunity to seize everything you ever wanted in one moment, would you capture it? Or would you let it slip? Welcome back to another episode of Dungeon Discourse. My name is Simon, and today we are going to be talking about one-shots and how you, yes you, can run them better. This video is going to focus on bits of advice that I have picked up over the years and some skills and tips that I've developed for myself. I hope that they will be useful for you as well. So, first of all, what is a one-shot if you're not familiar with the term? Most people, when they pick up a role-playing game, they think that they're going to have to be creating a big, sweeping, epic narrative that spans all of these different locations and iconic villains and memorable moments. That's your standard campaign, right? And a campaign is basically like running a really intense series of novels. Over the course of a long series, you have the time to develop all kinds of character development and deep, intense moments and really flesh out who your characters are and what your story is and get people invested in a really interesting world that you've built with the other people and by yourself. But a one-shot distills all of that narrative and drama into a very slim package. And you have to cram all of that experience into a very small space. So how do you go about doing that in just one 3 to 4 hour session? First of all, the most important piece of advice I can give anybody when you're running a one-shot is understand whether or not the game that you want to play or run was built for it in the first place. Dungeons and Dragons is built for campaign-based play. The way that the game structures progression in terms of gaining experience and magic items and equipment and all that stuff is really better suited to long-form games where you're going to be playing multiple sessions with the same characters and develop them over time. That isn't to say that you can't run a one-shot using D&D. You absolutely can, it just requires a little bit more prep work. And the reason for that is D&D is based so heavily around encounters and combat that you as the GM need to put in a little more elbow grease to create those encounters for people so that the game feels balanced. It doesn't always lend itself to improvisational play, which isn't to say that you can't improvise using D&D, but you may find that there are other games that suit your purposes better. For example, in the indie scene, we have games like Apocalypse World and Dungeon World. These are sort of the grandparents of the Powered by the Apocalypse movement, this one obviously in particular. And they're games that you can run in a single session and still have a solid experience, but also tend to get a little more interesting the more time you have to spend with those characters. The reason you need to know whether or not your game is better suited to a one-shot versus a campaign is because there are certain elements of that game that you may not get your hands on in a one-shot experience that really are necessary to make that game shine. And without several sessions of play, you're just not going to get that. Two other important things you need to know about the game you want to run are what the tone and the theme of the game are. If the game is about solving mysteries, then your one-shot is going to be better suited to solving mysteries as opposed to hacking and slashing. If the tone of your game is really grim, you should probably prepare your players for that kind of experience so that they don't come in trying to make comedic characters. If you're watching this video, I assume that you are going to be GMing this game. So my biggest piece of overall advice before you even start running the game is to read through the whole book cover to cover, make sure that you have a pretty good sense of how the rules work, and if there's anything that you're confused about or you're not entirely sure how the rule works, do a little research on it or flag it, and then when it comes up in game, don't be afraid to house rule it to keep the flow of the game moving. You can make sure that everyone is on the same page by printing out reference documents ahead of time. If a game comes with a list of what characters can do in combat, for example, print out several copies and have them available for players. That will make your life a little easier because players will have the chance to take a look at the rules and be responsible for the gameplay as much as you are. So let's talk about preparing the game itself. Once you've read through the book a couple times and you think that you know how the rules work more or less, you can start thinking about the story that you want to tell with this game. I'm not necessarily saying write out the whole plot of the adventure. If you already know exactly how things are supposed to go and how the players are supposed to respond to certain things, why are you playing a game with people? A core principle from games that are powered by the apocalypse is that we play to find out what happens. And this doesn't mean that you prepare nothing, just that you have a sense of where you want the game to go and then see how people get from point A to point B. Let's say you're running Dungeon World. Dungeon World is basically a indie riff on classic hack and slash fantasy adventure. Before I start running any Dungeon World one-shot, I take a look at the book and I see what monsters are available in the book that I think I'm interested in. Or if I have an idea for a monster that I would like to show off to people and think would make an exciting encounter, I'll write it up ahead of time because the rules are actually pretty easy in the book. For Dungeon World specifically, I'm not actually worried about encounter balance. It's a game where you don't have to fight every single thing that comes across your path, and sometimes monsters are just there to be obstacles for players, not necessarily combat encounters. When I'm preparing a one-shot, I also think a little bit about what scenes I want to throw into a game. So for example, if I'm playing a fantasy game, I might think about a giant bridge that's made entirely of ice that crosses a massive chasm in the middle of a snowstorm. And I might also think about how cool it would be if I had a giant ice dragon flying around on the outskirts of that scene, circling and threatening to attack the players on the bridge or smash into it. I might think about a swamp that players are walking through and they come across maybe a graveyard, and maybe they have to contend with poisonous spores or quicksand or something like that, while also fighting off undead that are rising from the swampy waters. Those two scenes could be in the same one-shot. I don't know how they're connected yet, but just having them in my back pocket means that I can start to push the story in those directions. And that's another important point that I want to make sure that we don't lose sight of. I, the GM, am pushing an agenda. I have a handful of scenes and monsters that I want to throw at players. Maybe I have an idea of how I want this one-shot to end up, like what the final encounter is, or maybe a couple of scenes that I want to hit on. But the ways in which we get to those scenes are mostly determined by the players, because the players are going to throw out different kinds of ideas of how they get between those different encounters. And they're also going to volunteer information about things that they're excited about or things that they're interested in. The thing you have to balance here is what players are pitching to you as what they want to engage with, and how you can make that fit with a cohesive narrative, as well as the different story beats and bits of information that you want to pass out. And knowing how to handle that balance is really hard. It takes a lot of work. To be honest with you, GMing is a skill just as much as anything else. And the only way to get better at it is just to practice. So once I have a little bit of inspiration rolling around in the back of my head, I'll start to prepare the player's end of things. Back to Dungeon World for a second. Dungeon World uses playbooks for its characters. These are basically just character classes, except that if you are playing the fighter, you are the fighter. You're the only person in the world who has this particular skill at combat. And you also get a signature weapon that you get to design, which is really cool. If you're the wizard, you're the only person in the world that can wield magics like this. There may be other people that know how to cast a basic spell. Maybe there aren't. Usually it means you're the one person that has control over that element of the story. If I want to run a game that's a little more focused on smashing and grabbing and stealing loot and pulling off heists within Dungeon World, then I probably don't want to have certain playbooks available to people. An urban heist game is probably not going to be a setting where a druid or a ranger gets a chance to shine unless I do some modification to those playbooks. And if I want to run a one-shot that focuses a little more on action like games in Diablo have, where there are ancient evils that are emerging from dark dimensions and we must crush the skeleton king beneath our boots, the bard might have a bad time. It makes a lot more sense in games like Masks, a superheroes game, where certain playbooks are a little more focused on very serious drama and others are a little more lighthearted. And some playbooks are about cosmic struggles and others are more about day-to-day slice of life. You can learn a little bit more about that in the context of Masks by watching that video by Brandon Leon Gambetta over on his channel. To some people, this might seem like a weird thing that you're sort of cutting off what options are available to players. But the reality is that if you have a more consistent collection of characters, they're going to fit the story a little bit better. They're going to bring more to the table because they have a more cohesive set of options that they can use to advance the story in a satisfying way. Okay, so you've done some basic prep, you've pulled out some playbooks, you figured out kind of what characters you want to encourage people to play. It's time to actually get some friends together and sit down at the table and play a game. During character creation, it's important that you make sure that everyone has the same level of expectation for the game. If you like to run a little more goofy game, that's fine. Just make sure that everyone knows that that's what is going to happen. If anyone has any content that they really don't want to see, please look into using lines and veils, tools like the X card and other things that make sense for your play group to make sure that everyone is on the same page about what kind of content is acceptable and how everyone at the table can stay safe. Once everyone has rolled up to the table, it's also important that you, the GM, out of game, kind of understands a little bit more about your players. If you know that someone at your table is really into role-playing, then you should probably think about how you're going to incorporate some negotiations or discussions or at least some strong characterization into your one-shot. If you have a player that's really into just hitting stuff with an axe, that's great too. Make sure that you throw in some combat for them. If you know that someone that's showing up is really into puzzles or brain teasers, go ahead and look up a couple of riddles ahead of time and figure out how you might throw them into a dungeon. Or make sure that you invite that person when you're running a murder mystery. Character creation during a one-shot is extremely important to pay attention to, because the characters that people are making are going to determine the kinds of encounters that you should present to them. If I'm running a one-shot and a player creates a rogue and is really interested in being a rogue, I know that I need to throw in a few more traps and locks for them to pick. Otherwise, why are they playing a rogue? It's just not going to be fun if they have all these really cool abilities to sneak and ambush people and disable traps and things like that, and they don't get to use them at all. If I have a player that makes a ranger or a druid and has the ability to talk to animals, I should probably throw in a few animals for them to talk to, because otherwise they should have just played a different character. Also, during character creation, you can pay attention to the little bits of character that people are developing that you can sneak away and insert into your story. If someone is coming up with an idea of their character being a famous swashbuckler, how did they get their skills? Maybe you can incorporate their teacher into your story. Maybe that's the person that gives them their quest. If you have a character that's a cleric or gains their powers through a pact with some unknowable being, maybe the being that's giving those powers asks for a favor and it is not optional. Or the god of that cleric could intervene at a crucial moment in the story. Whatever these things are, it's important to take a few notes during character creation, because if you don't incorporate these things during the game, some players may feel a little put out. In a campaign, you have a lot more time to develop these different characters and bring them down their own little personal stories and resolve their own personal dramas. In a one-shot, you don't have that kind of time. You have to make it count. But the last thing that I'll say about character creation, don't spend too much time on it. It's really fun to write characters that have really rich, engaging backstories, but we're not going to see all of that in a one-shot. And if we just draw enough information out that we get the sketch of that character and what their story is going to be and what things that they're going to do, that's enough for us to go on. We'll fill in the blanks as we go. Now let's talk about running the game itself. So, once you have your characters, take a little bit of time to figure out how you want to begin the game based on what people are giving you. If you have a lot of very combat-heavy characters, maybe you want to start them off with a fight. If you have a bunch of characters that are a little more mystical and arcane, maybe they are in the middle of investigating a arcane mystery. Either way, I think it's best that you start off any one-shot being in the middle of the action, or en media res. This gets people excited right off the bat, it sets the stakes, and it sets the tone for the whole game. It doesn't always have to be a life or death situation, but one way or another, you are at the source of the adventure. First encounter is a great way to let players interact with the game world in a high-stakes environment, and helps guide where you want the adventure to go. After that, I would say probably give people a little bit of time to get into character, to do some role-playing and some investigation about what they think is going on or where they want to go next. And then just kind of keep nudging the story along by throwing in some of those encounters and monsters and story beats that you had come up with before. When a golden opportunity arises, take it. If a character says something that they hope isn't behind the door, whatever they said is definitely behind the door. From here, the game is just a conversation. You're throwing out some ideas, the players are bouncing them back at you, they're introducing their own ideas and their own story concepts, and as long as you're nudging them gently towards each of those different key bits of information that you want to disseminate about the adventure, or those different encounters that you're building towards some kind of climax, you're doing it right. Time is a factor in one-shots. So I would say 2 to 3 encounters is about as many as you can throw at players in, let's say, a 4-hour session. During this whole time, players may have given you an idea about who your final antagonist is if you haven't already set it in stone. Just keep teasing that information out of people, and if you don't know the answer to something, ask the players and let them decide. When it's time to finally run that showdown, you can just let loose and have fun with it. Don't be afraid to raise the stakes. Maybe an NPC in a character's backstory is being held prisoner by the antagonist. Maybe the final encounter is a battle on top of a crumbling volcano. However your game ends, make sure that every player at your table had a chance to shine. And if they haven't yet, give them that chance now. I ran a game recently where I offered a lot of opportunities for the different characters in this fantasy one-shot to do different cool things with their abilities, like talking to animals and using their animal companion, or using magic to solve mysteries and dungeon traps and overcome different challenges within the dungeon that they were running through. But by the final encounter, there was one player who was playing a fire-based class, sort of had a lot of like cool fire magic, and they hadn't had the chance to use their abilities in a way that I felt was really satisfying for them. So part of the final showdown was players having to fight off a cult that was trying to perform a ritual on a ancient phoenix corpse. And this phoenix had been corrupted with ice magic and had its magic being harnessed by this cult for nefarious purposes. As part of that final encounter, I decided it would be really interesting if that player got the chance to use their fire magic to re-enkindle the spark of the phoenix. And it would require them to temporarily sacrifice all of their fire magic abilities just to perform this one action. Of course, they gave up their powers, and it allowed us to have a really dramatic moment of other players looking at this person and saying, oh my god, like, are you really going to do that? Well, we have to protect you while this thing goes off. And it was a really cool story moment to have people protecting that character as they infused their fire soul into this phoenix. Of course, they got their powers back in the end, but seeing the expressions on everyone's faces when we presented that story beat just felt really good. And if you can walk away from any one shot that you run where a player looks back at a moment and says, yeah, that was me, I did that, then I think you've succeeded. That's going to do it for me for today. If you found this video enjoyable, please do give me a like and subscribe. And if you do subscribe, make sure that you ring the bell so that you get notified whenever I drop any new videos. If you have a topic or a question that you'd like me to tackle, go ahead and send me a message. You can find me on social media, on Twitter, @LuchaLibris. I hope that you're all fired up now to run some one-shots of your own, so take +1 forward when you act on this information, and I'll see you in the next video.